Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to this explorations of blockchain technology and energy systems that we've organized through and by the Clean Energy Business Council. So it's a pleasure really to have participants from across the world. Let me take you through some initial thoughts on this, and my agenda is in front of you right now. So we're going to talk to start off, what is blockchain technology? What sort of applications do we have of blockchain currently? What is the prospect for using blockchain in energy systems? And then I'll want to focus a little bit on some of the issues and challenges in the terms of the application of blockchain technology. And then, of course, I want to talk a little bit about our Clean Energy Business Council. So let's look now at what is blockchain technology. What do we mean by that? I've chosen one of the best definitions I've seen around. At a high level, what we're talking about is this is a network of computers. Some of them call them nodes, but effectively it's a network of computers. And they regularly update and give you information on the true state of a distributed ledger. That is a ledger not in centralized, but decentralized. And these ledgers contain a lot of shared data, transactions, attributes, and others. And importantly, each of the ledgers is secured through using modern cryptography. And importantly, it does not refer to a central computer or to a central node. And therefore, this is the sort of thing that allows BitChain to work. So if we look at the example of payments on how BitChain is used for payments, because that is the current application of that. Let's suppose you have two people who want to send money. A wants to send money to B. They have the amount, you have information about who the senders are, and related information, which is encrypted, and then goes on to a block. This block is then shared across the whole network of computers. There is a consensus mechanism between the computers, part of the system, which verifies the block. And when everybody verifies it, it then gets added to the chain. And once it's added to the chain, it's difficult to falsify or to change. And once that is done, then automatically the money moves from A to B. Now, how does that compare to what we do currently? So if we look at currently, the current systems that we have, on the far left, we've got the traditional model. So each of the pillars, buildings with pillars is like a bank. And in the middle, you've got the central bank. And whenever you're exchanging money or to send money, you send it to your bank. And the person you have sending the money to has their own correspondent bank. They may not be the same. And the transactions go to the central bank. So everything is centralized. With blockchain, you have two possibilities. One is what we call open systems, public blockchain, which doesn't require permissions, which everybody is networked into. And this is the current Bitcoin model. And as we said, the information is shared and verified by each of the computers. You have another possibility also, which is a private blockchain as opposed to the public blockchain, where potentially a number of participants can restrict access to the blockchain. And this, for example, today is what the banks like to move towards, because of course it protects their business. But these are currently the two types of options. And you could consider that maybe for some trade-related activities or for some communities, they might want to have a private blockchain as opposed to a public blockchain. And as we'll see later on, and as some of my co-panelists will talk about, having a public blockchain can be very expensive in terms of the use of electricity. So if we look at what are the aspects, why is this so important? I call it transformational, really, because this is really a revolution that can be happening. the first thing that you're doing is you're validating the existence of something through blockchain. And it can be a transaction, it can be a trade, it can be the identity. Second, it protects the transaction, so you cannot have duplicate transactions. Because remember, this is shared across all the computers, across the different nodes. So you might change it on one computer, you cannot change it on all, and therefore it prevents any duplication. It also is a recording mechanism. So automatically things are archived, they're validated, they're authenticated. So if there's any dispute between parties, they can go back and to the blockchain and find out. Importantly, and this is probably one of the most important aspects of blockchain, is that it is peer-to-peer or business-to-business or person-to-business. So it can be consumers relating to a company, retail or other. And remember here, the critical thing, it does not require any intermediation. You do not need to go through a government, you don't need to go through a central bank. It is a person-to-person or a business-to-business, and it is highly protected. The other important thing is that it's using shared infrastructure. So it is much lower cost. You don't need to invest in new things. What you're doing is you're using the internet in a highly protected and secured way. And also, because all the information is collected, if you're doing, say, transactions across the border, say, sending money or goods across the border, it increases the transparency. So you know what is happening. So for example, if you're buying and selling diamonds, let's say, and you want to make sure they were not stolen or didn't come from a country which is ostracized, the diamond itself becomes encrypted. And when it goes across borders, you have a verification of all the transactions. You know where it is, where it has been, who has bought it, who has sold it. You have integrity of the bookkeeping because nobody can change. It's practically impossible to change the record. And therefore, you've got both transparency and integrity. And of course, you've got security because everything is encrypted. So this is really the power of blockchain. And if we look at the potential uses, they're very, very wide. So I've illustrated in the slide, it goes all the way from, we mentioned already, banks and financial institutions, but it's very important in terms of government. So it could be verifying securely your identity. It can be used for property if you're looking at the legal aspects, who owns a property, who has bought and sold it over time. You can use it through supply chains and in the food industry to verify where was a particular product produced, how was it traded, who added something to it. So it really grows across practically all our lives. And it means an application that transforms the way we do business, but also allows us to be much more secure. So if you look at the middle box, that compares to, if you look at the past, say before 2005, everything was centralized in the Internet of Things, and it was separate silos. Where we then moved to much more open access in terms of Internet of Things networks, but it was still a centralized cloud. Now we're opening it up completely, and what you're doing is you've got the Internet of Things, but it's a distributed cloud. It's everywhere, and therefore much more difficult to control and much more secure than it was before. So let's turn next to what it means for the It could be for trading in terms of industry, and both producers. And here the producers are no longer just power companies or utility companies. They can be consumers themselves. They can be households. So we're starting to use a new term. Instead of talking about producers and consumers, we're talking about prosumers. That is, households that are both consumers of energy and producers of energy. And therefore now it's distributed. And if you think about that, it is very much a revolution in terms of energy, because everybody can contribute to the grid, and everybody can benefit from that. So you can have peer-to-peer trading. You can identify who is on the grid and who is using it. So you also can identify the assets securely, so you can track them. So the range of uses of blockchain is across all aspects of energy. So let's illustrate that in this next slide, just to show the difference between what we have today and what we'll have in the future. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see there's something let's call it a mini grid. Why is that interesting? It's interesting because this could be a small community somewhere. It could be a village. It could be a small town somewhere. And they have their own mini grid. And the reason why this is so interesting is because today you've got many developing countries that don't have a central grid. They cannot access. Think of countries in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, where people don't really have access to electricity. With blockchain and with renewable energy, you could have a local community, a small village, which produces its own electricity, trades it. A neighbor can sell electricity to his neighbor, and it's a transformation. Yeah, you no longer need a national grid. You can produce a market, so you can trade carbon, you can trade electricity across borders. You can do what we call balancing, that is being able to access sources of energy practically across the globe eventually, and have the trading and payment being done through blockchain. On the right-hand side, for example, there are some uses we're currently looking at, such as electric vehicles being charged and payment being made. So the blockchain gets applied not only to transmission of electricity, to generation of electricity through public utilities, whatever they may be. It goes into the storage of electricity. It goes into the distribution of energy. So the blockchain really can apply across all the way from production to trading to final consumption. So very wide uses. And I think we'll be discussing that on the panel a little bit later. Although this looks marvelous, of course, and this is a lovely picture for the future, but it comes along with a number of questions, and they're mainly legal in particular. The first is that if you're moving away from centralized transactions model to a decentralized, then one question becomes, who is responsible for the settlement of the financial transactions? Because there will be financial transactions, there are payments going to and from. Who's responsible for that, and if something goes wrong? One particular issue is, today, for example, public utilities are licensed and they're regulated. What happens if you have a decentralized system? I could, in my own household, be producing electricity. Do I have to meet the same regulatory requirements as a big utility? If so, it would prevent the system from developing. The other major issue is that, of course, energy systems are considered to be critical infrastructure. If they break down, the whole economy can break down. So can you operate a decentralized system without a central authority? Major issue. And what sort of emergencies? What would happen if you had an emergency? What if there's a big storm that affects Europe or somewhere else? We're entering into a period where because of climate change, there could be big disruptions. So how do we deal with that? Another issue is who protects the prosumer. In standard current systems, a consumer buys electricity from a public utility or off the grid. We have systems and laws and regulations which protect that consumer. What happens if it's a decentralized model? Who's going to protect the prosumer? So where are we in terms of regulations? If you look across on a global basis, you'll see that we're at the beginning. So if you look at blockchain regulations across the globe right now, that's in the next slide, you'll see that countries differ quite a bit in terms of how advanced they are. The United States has said that each state within the United States can introduce its own blockchain rules and regulations. I've given you some examples there in terms of recent developments. The most important one and very interesting one is Delaware, which of course is not a state. It's a district. Now they've introduced a modern blockchain law, and they're using that for company formation, to give you a clear idea of who owns shares, how is the trading in the shares. So quite a bit of transparency there. So a very good example of how you can use blockchain. Europe itself, the EU, is being very proactive, and the Commission is now working on overall blockchain framework, including laws and regulations. Much of it might be modeled on the German Energy Industry Act, which is near completion. That's an interesting one to look at because it has specific provisions for protecting prosumers or consumers. Asia and other places are still working at it. You've got more regulatory sandboxes, as we call them, RegTech, trying to see how you can test and pilot blockchains. An interesting one is what's coming out of Switzerland, particularly when you've got these cryptocurrencies. They're now issue an initial code of conduct for initial coin offerings. So this is a good one for you to follow on. In the region, in the MENA region itself, things are really in their infancy. One country I think stands out, that's the UAE. They don't have any laws which prohibit the use of blockchain, so you can actually develop it. But in particular, I think government itself has been very proactive. So in particular, Dubai wants to use blockchain across all government services and activities, from land and property to any relation with government and government services by 2020. So that's in less than 2 years. They've established a blockchain council. So they're really pushing, for example, electric vehicles and setting up a framework. So UAE is a country to look at in terms of what's happening in the region. So let's end really by talking a little bit about what sort of challenges really are we facing in terms of blockchain energy. The first thing that we should note is that renewable energy, as well as artificial intelligence and blockchain, are really two revolutions. Renewable energy is transforming the whole energy landscape. Blockchain and the combination of blockchain and artificial intelligence will be pervasive and will be disruptive for many activities and industries. So we're seeing two revolutions come together. We're still at the beginnings of it. So it's going to be big transformation over the next few years. Second point, I think, is that blockchain is very much starting in the banking and financial industry, particularly in payments. And once that is done, I think it'll transmit itself to other activities. A major issue, and I think we'll discuss that later on in the panel, is that blockchain uses a lot of energy, it uses a lot of power just to mine Bitcoin. So can it become a GPT? Can it become a general purpose technology if it consumes excessive amounts of power, and how do we control that? The power industry, centralized utilities will be completely transformed. You no longer need them. So this decentralization is going to be a major feature of energy systems. But in order to really benefit from these two revolutions, it's going to require massive investments, both in hardware in terms of plant equipment and how they relate to each other, but also soft. You need the people, you need the legal and regulatory framework to facilitate that. And the final point, I think, an important one for energy producers like the GCC countries, is that the energy landscape is going to be rapidly changing. So they need to develop strategies for dealing with blockchain, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. That's going to be a major challenge for many of them. So let me just end by just a couple of words on the Clean Energy Business Council, which is hosting this webinar. It's a membership organization. We're a not-for-profit and an NGO. We really represent the private sector and most of the big businesses working in clean energy across the region and clean technology. And our aim is really to increase public awareness, have a dialogue between the private sector and the public sector, and between all the technology producers, and also in particular really to help put in place regulations and laws which will facilitate the development of clean energy and clean technology. So what are the things that we do? A variety of things. We're active across the region. We look at developing partnerships both between our members and the private sector and government in particular. We have lots of events, including, say, a webinar and others, so that they can collaborate. We produce research done by our members. And much of the research is policy-oriented, so we like to present solutions. We have white papers trying to say which are the positive ways to move forward. We're very much into advocacy, thought leadership, and we host a large number of workshops and events throughout. And we've got a number of working groups, for example, a new electric vehicles working group, which was going to become a club. We have one on policy and energy efficiency, one in terms of schools. So our members go to schools across, in particular, the UAE. And we've got one for women in clean energy, all the women, and we want to encourage more women to go into this new industry. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about. And thank you really for participating, but of course also to invite you to become a member of the CBC. So if you just go to our website, you'll see you can become an individual member or a company can become a member. So thank you very much.